Good evening and welcome to this evening's heart to heart conversation. Martin Luther King and DE&I, are we living the dream? And so that is the question that we want to address today in our session as we come off of the Martin Luther King holiday, which was celebrated on Monday for a lot of people in the US as well as in Canada. And so, we want to continue the discussion as it relates to Martin Luther King and living the dream. So, in Martin Luther King's book, the last book that he wrote before he passed away, he said, "We are now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is a such thing as being too late. Procrastination is still the thief of time. Life often leaves us standing bare, naked, and dejected with a loss of opportunities. This may be mankind's last chance to choose between chaos or community." And so for me, in the words of Martin Luther King, this is the work of DE&I, not just today, but what was happening then, even though it didn't have that DE&I term. And so today I am joined by an all-star panel of guests and friends. And so our distinguished panel consists of Clarice Tolston, who is a DE&I Talent Acquisition Vice President. We have Dr. Sorrell Williams, who is a global DE&I strategist. And we have Norman Miles, who is the Senior Vice President and Director of DE&I and Social Impact. And so I want to welcome my panel today. Now, we had an assignment, a homework assignment, and I had asked each of the panel to share with me some of what their favorite quote is from Dr. Martin Luther King. And so we're going to start with you, Clarice, and if you could just share with us what your favorite quote.
The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in a moment of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at the times of challenge and controversy. And I think that represents the core of what DEI means for a lot of people. When it's comfortable and everything's easygoing, we don't take that consideration to make a stand for what it is we believe in. And so it's saying, stand up at a time where you really are going to be effective and impactful when it comes to the work and creating the framework for us that work in organizations or social or nonprofit. So that's why that quote resonated with me.
Fantastic. And so will you share with us just a little bit about your DE&I journey? What brought you to this place?
My D&I journey started at a very unusual place. It started in internship. I run the internship for, I ran the internship for organization, and it was right after George Floyd and right in the beginning start of COVID. And my interns were really having a hard time with why we were at work and were really vocal about being at work. And so even though that was the origin, the work for me didn't start until a few months later, but it sparked an interest in me. And it kind of goes to the quote, everything was comfortable and convenient. And so I was never challenged with looking at DEI within the organization, especially being in talent acquisition. And so they lit a fire in me. And so that fire is still burning bright right now. So I had the opportunity to look at DEI and see where we were being unfair in our hiring practices when it came to people. We were a large organization, a global organization, over 5,000 people. So my interns are the one that got my wheels turning and saying like, hey, there's something to be done and you're the one to do it.
Fantastic, fantastic. Okay, so we're going to go to our second panelist, Dr. Sorrell Williams. And so why don't you share with us your favorite quote?
Sure. My favorite quote is the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And this is a quote that I really love, especially in the context of the work that we do now, because this type of work has been going on for what I would say forever when it comes to justice. And it feels like it's never going to end. My uncle called me last night when I was at dinner. He's close 80 something years old, and he
Okay.
was asking me my thoughts about DEI and how things are.
Hmm.
And what I told him was that the things that we've been experiencing, we're going to continue to experience by and large to some degree. And he agreed. He said that he had been dealing with these types of things 50 years ago.
Right.
How we described them might have been different, but we're still experiencing a lot of the same challenges that we've experienced, especially when it comes to the outcomes.
Yeah. And so can you share with us your DE&I journey and what brought you here?
My journey, I think, started in high school with this exact uncle I'm talking about. I
Okay.
had a conversation with him in the kitchen about my frustration about the experiences that Black people were having in the community and wanting
Mhm.
to do something about it. And he told me that there's really nothing that I can do except do
Wow.
the right thing myself. And that just
Mm.
didn't feel like it was good enough. And when I
Okay.
decided to go to graduate school, I felt like I had the opportunity to do something different. So I explicitly went to study and do research around the biases that underrepresented people experience as an organization with the intent of actually wanting to do something about it. So that's
Great.
why I attended graduate school within that realm and started doing work at that time over 20 years ago within this space and just continue to grow professionally doing research within that area and applying all the things that I've learned from practice and research within organizations till today. I'm still doing that.
Fantastic. All right, Norm, last but not least, why don't you go ahead and share with us your favorite quote?
Absolutely. My favorite quote, and like I said, I had a ton of these, but this one has always stuck with me. And Dr. King said, "The means that we use must be as pure as the ends that we seek."
Okay.
And that really kind of encapsulates what I talk about almost on a daily basis around what DE&I and I expanded to this concept around social impact needs to be.
Okay.
And that means that we have to develop transparency and authenticity in this work, and it has to be covered with grace. And I think that this quote kind of again embodies all of that in the meanings and what we need to do to try to advance this as a body of work that's just not something that's a something that we react 2020, but how do we really embed this as a fundamental element that people live by? And so that quote was something that again always stuck with me and one that I use quite often.
Sure. And so share with us how you got here. What's your DE&I journey?
So my journey really started almost kind of like since birth. So my
Okay.
dad was actually in the civil rights movement and as a minister and as well as a professor. So I was a kid and learned about Dr. King. I was reading and quoting Nikki Giovanni when I was 6. So we had it kind of embedded in our household around activism and around the whole elements of what Dr. King stood for. And so, as I progressed in my career, I did different things, but I always had DEI, even though it didn't necessarily pronounce itself as a formal title or term,
Right.
as part of my practice and what
Great.
I did.
Okay.
So in terms of taking it to kind of the formal roles that I've had kind of in the last few years, I got on this journey, very intently because of honestly a person who I was working with at one of my old firms. We're the largest human capital firm, and we were doing DE&I work. And DEI was not that hot a few years ago, if you all would remember.
Right.
And it was not so
Non-existent.
hot that the fact
Mhm.
that they right, yeah. So they actually fired the lady that I work with, and so I kind of took
Okay.
over all of the responsibilities for leading DE&I, and
Okay.
and then all of a sudden, May of 2020 came,
Mm.
and that opened up the floodgates and everybody's realization around how essential DEI and social impact is to the fabric of your operations and how you deal with people and purpose and all that. And so that's really how I got into it as a formal kind of title, and again have been growing that since. And that's why I said I bring into this conversation social impact because and
Mhm.
I'll talk about it probably a little bit earlier, but the DE&I in many cases, people are starting to get this level of fatigue around it. And
Right.
I tell people to make sure that we keep this conversation alive. We have to make sure
Mhm.
something else ties us all together, and that's social impact. So, and I think that's what
Yes.
Dr. King talked about all the time as well. So that's again something that I introduce and speak about all the time. And I say this work, and I think all of us on the panel will feel the same way.
Mhm.
You know, I tell people, they're like, "Oh, I'm so passionate about DEI," and I tell people I'm not passionate about it at all, and it freaks them out. They're like, "What?"
Right.
I said, "No," I said I'm not passionate about it at all. So I'm purposed. I
Right.
said, "There's a difference. There's a
There's a
big
big
difference,
difference. Yes.
and you have to
Yes.
be built. You have to be built for this." And
Right.
because we all know it's hard work. So anyway, so that's
Mhm.
been my journey, and that's my purpose.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. So we're gonna move on to the next slide, and I just wanted to share a couple of concepts with you all, and get your take on what these things are. So very quickly we can get those back up. So when looking and doing some research on MLK's teachings and DE&I, right? Like, so he taught us to put the needs of those who had less and who exist at the margins of society at the center of our policy efforts. So when you hear that, and anyone can jump in on this. I mean, do you see this as still a part of the fundamental work as a DE&I, leader?
I can start just by saying I think it's fundamental. It's kind of what Norm and Sorrell just mentioned. It's part of the tactical part, right? Because my lens is coming from hiring, bringing people into organizations, looking at how the job descriptions, looking at, or is it inclusive, looking
Right.
at how we're hiring, where our jobs are being advertised, who has access to that, those
Right.
types of jobs. So it has to be embedded in policy because it just can't be a feel-good moment. It just can't be
Right.
something can't be something people feel passionate about, right? And people feel entitled or excited about, because excitement burns, passion burns. And
Yes.
that's why
Yes.
having that work is, so embedded in people. But I think it has to be in policy, it has to be in work, it has to be in action, it has to be part of an actual process. It has to be standard operating procedure for a lot of people that are coming into the organization. And the more standard it becomes, the better it becomes when it comes from the generation that's coming into the workforce. It'll be a lot easier for them to kind of understand those concepts.
Yeah. And the next one I would ask of Sorrell, but he seems like he's in the matrix right now. He's kind of
I was noticing that.
yeah,
That was
you
really weird that happened.
yeah, don't follow the white rabbit. I mean, if you could just stay here with us for a minute, that would be great. But the next statement is he called us to be kinder to one another and consider the needs, hopes, and desires of others. Do you think that this is a fundamental concept for DE&I?
I would say yes.
Okay.
And I say yes, and largely I think about the needs particularly of others when we start having conversations about things like equity, because that's something that's a really important concept that we need to think about in organizations that people either misunderstand, take for granted, and don't really get what that means. And
Mhm.
equity and equality are not the same thing. They're actually different. I see myself flickering. Hope you can still hear me, but they're
Can we
not.
hear you?
And when we
Right.
think about things like equity versus equality, we in thinking about the people who exist on the margins of society, they often have different needs than the people who don't exist on the margins of society. So an example of that is when we start thinking about policy or processes, there's tons of research. We can see this anecdotally that say Black women, for example, tend to get less feedback, or feedback that's focused on personality traits, or feedback that's not actionable. So because we know this is going to impact the perceptions of performance of Black women. That's going to
Right.
impact whether or not they're getting promoted. That's going to impact whether or not they engage in or stay in the organization. It's going to
Right.
impact their compensation. And that has downstream impacts with respect to things like generational wealth in our community and family, et cetera, et cetera. There's all these downstream impacts to that. And what we need to recognize, because that happens, there might be things that Black women need from a feedback process perspective that white men might not need. So for
Right.
example, is there a second look if a Black woman and a white man are both going up for a promotion? Do you take a second look at why the Black woman didn't get promoted? Because we
Right.
know what tends to happen is that there's bias in the process. So
Right.
can you force that?
Okay, we lost him right now, but I don't know if Norma Clarice, I know that this is what we deal with every day. Did anyone
Right.
want to pick up where he left off? Because
Yeah, I was going to say something that, a lot of the work that I had done kind of in my previous firm was around the whole element around DEI and embedding it as part of organizational strategy, opposed
Right.
to what I call like feel good bolt-ons. And what he was going
Mhm.
into in terms of like hiring elements and sometimes promotions and biases within process and systems within organizations is absolutely real. But
Right.
there's just some other things that we bring as underrepresented populations to the
Mhm.
table that somehow feed into the narrative. And I'll give you the example.
Yes.
A
Yes.
lot of the study that we used to do was around hiring. We called it velocity within organizations.
Mhm.
And we do
Mhm.
studies around how perceptions of what is necessary for you to achieve within an organization, what are some of those key elements that you need to do. And so we did tons of studies, and some of the questions that we would ask to draw out some of those things were, we would get we call a control and contrast group. And so the control group, typically white males or white females. And
Mhm.
we'd have people of color, and we'd ask these questions. And one of the things that always stood out to me in this battery of questions that we asked was, what is one of the key elements for promotion in your organization? And you had a
Okay.
selection from is that technical skill,
Mhm.
organizational savvy, or political nuance? What are the
Right.
indicators out of those three selections that you would see are as most important for you to advance in your organization? And
Right.
most often in those studies, the white males would choose social impact, or political nuance and
The
organizational
nuances.
savvy
Right. Right.
Mhm.
as the most important indicators for advancement.
Which
People
is
of
another
color
way of
and
saying
women,
fitting in, like how you fit in, right?
Mhm.
In terms of like it's a fit in kind of
correct,
statement,
co-
right? Okay.
absolutely. But the
Mhm.
compelling thing that I'm saying fed into the narrative of how people move is that people of color and women selected technical skills
Okay.
as what they thought were the most important elements to feed success.
Mm.
And
Right.
so
Competent.
the
Competency,
organizations,
right.
exactly,
Hmm.
and organizations by far, as we know, higher indexed towards what the white males supported as what are the things that are required for you to succeed. And so by
Right.
virtue of us thinking like, hey, if I'm just the most technically sound, if I keep working this and I'm the absolute best person in this absolute role, they're
Hmm.
definitely going to
Hmm.
promote me. And that
Right.
doesn't bear out.
Right. And Clarice, you look
And
like you want to
so
Yeah.
add something
No,
to
you
that.
just get rewarded with more work. That is the
Right.
non-promotional reward
there you
is
go.
more work, more assignments, more projects, more accountability, and and you increase work and decrease value.
There
Right.
you go.
Because
And
the
you
more
you
you do,
become
the more
someone.
they expect you to do, right? So, right.
Correct. They don't want so then you become the person, well, I don't want to promote her because she's the workhorse of the group. And
Right.
so that's why part of this work of DEI, when we're talking about creating inclusive leadership and educating people and moving organizations away from, again, this being just a feel good thing where you have a potluck and celebrate a holiday every once in a while. That's not diversity. It's about
Right.
how do we change the framework and the systems that support how we
Hmm.
look at people and how we reward people. And it's kind of a conversation I have more broadly when I talk about evaluating communities, because that's kind of what I do now in terms of, how do things that we do from, I work for architecture and engineering firm. When we build a hospital, how does that impact a community ecosystem? Not just
Right.
one person, but the entire ecosystem. And a lot of
Hmm.
times when we start to look at how to do that, we evaluate community from the lenses of their demographic deficiencies. And what I try to tell people, we should stop looking at people from their demographical deficiencies and start
Hmm.
reviewing them by how can we help them to prosper in the ecosystem. And what is it that we're doing, either intended or unintended, that leads to that neglect? And so it's the same kind of way when we're talking about developing people. Stop focusing on, the fact that, yes, there is an element of discrimination and racism and bias.
Right.
I tell you, I can't arrest, convict, and convert everybody's hearts and minds, but I can change a process, and that's where we can create the change.
Right. And in terms of Clarice, like in terms of being kinder to one another, like, I mean, and how do you translate kindness into a DE&I, initiative?
I would say I would start with the I part, inclusive, being inclusive, right?
Okay.
I think to be kind, to be empathetic, to be mindful of other people's traditions. I focus a lot of my time in early career. So people that are coming into college via the internship, or this is being their first job, and they are a lot kinder to people because they're in these ecosystems where people are all globally in an institution or globally in academia. But when they get into corporate, especially as you funnel up leadership, there's only kind of one mindset. There's one way of doing things. We mentioned it earlier in our conversation, it's institutionalized. And so it is, the generation, I think that's Y, or somebody help join, like, I think it's Generation Y that's coming into the workforce this year, graduating this year. They have a very different outlook when it comes to DE&I. And I also think that they're the reasons why this thing will continue to go on, not so much the current workforce, because I came at a time when, especially through leadership, where you did good, you kept your head down, you found a mentor, and you could try to help and promote and mentor people in back channels, but you weren't so vocal. Now as I've gone up the ranks, I'm able to be like, I can help you, and and get you to where you need to be. But I just don't think there's a lot of it. And I think that's being kind to people. And I'll give you this example. One of the ways we can be kinder is when women, especially because that's who the majority of, and from my perspective, who ask me for advice or ask me for mentorship, me being kind and being honest with them. Yeah. Especially when they're going out for these jobs and for these big roles and stuff like that. And they're like, I want it. I'm competent. And it says, yes, but what are the social norms of that organization? What research have you done? And when people ask me for mentorship, I'm like, you have to come prepared. I'm not, you have to come prepared. You have to do your homework. You have to be there. And I think that's a way of being kind, is being honest to women who want to be developed, to Black women who want to be developed and get to this process, and to be truthful to them about the process so that they can have a realistic take and create a different mindset when they're applying for these, director, supervisor, manager, VP roles. And so I think that's one of the ways I think we can be kind, is by being honest and transparent with them to help them get into those spaces a lot easier than if they go around, and circumvent the process.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. So Sorrel, welcome back. Welcome back. All right. So the next quote or statement is that he inspired us to a collective vision for a better nation, one that would earnestly reconcile ourselves with the darkness of our past so we could courageously live into the light of our highest and truest selves. So what is the struggle from a DE&I standpoint when we're dealing with the past?
I think that a lot of, and from my experience, I feel like there's a little bit of resistance to accept why things are the way they are when we start talking about systemic racism or injustice. A lot of people cannot reconcile that, or won't reconcile that, or won't accept that. And it makes it difficult for some people to actually try to want to do the right thing. And another one of my favorite quotes by Martin Luther King is, "It is a cruel jest to ask a bootless man to lift himself up by his bootstraps." And he's talking about that in the context of all the things that the white landowners or Americans were given after slavery, and how Black slaves were giving nothing. And we were told to lift ourselves up by our bootstraps. And we're like, what bootstraps? And then that has carried over today generationally and impacted the systems that we live in right now. So I think it's a little bit of that people not recognizing the large part of that is impacting where we are. And when you talk about the social impact perspective, there's a lot of work that I think we're.
Oh no.
All right. So Norm, you want to jump in here?
Yeah. I hate that it looked like he was on a roll too.
Yeah,
You
right.
know, something that just talking about, and I've just been thinking about this a lot. And from Dr. King's perspective, and it's kind
Hmm.
of like what I think that when he be thinking about DE&I now, and talking about making a better nation. What are some of those things that I think that this nation and probably collectively the world experiences or experiencing, but I'll specifically talk about this nation. And I think what is hindering us from being a better nation is the element around, and Dr. King talked about soft-mindedness. And
Okay.
we've entered this age now where facts are subjective and
Mm.
easily dismissed, and whatever your level of social media output is, what creates the veracity of your comment. And we've moved into this age where, again, dismissing facts allows you to just miss all these other things that we're talking about in terms of how do you get to a place where you create empathy? How do you get to a place
Right.
that starts to galvanize people together?
Hmm.
Because again, people are dismissive, and I often say, Adolf Hitler used to say all the time, "I use emotion for the many and reserve reason for the few."
Hmm.
And we're kind of in this age where everything is aligned to emotion,
Yeah.
and that's what supports conversation and perspective, particularly when we talk about DEI. And that's why people get so uncomfortable. They get all
Yeah.
Hmm.
wound up because it causes you to have to move beyond your emotion and move to those elements that are uncomfortable, because empathy is uncomfortable, because I may have
Exactly.
to align to something that maybe I don't get. Maybe I don't get it. And that's why I tell
Hmm.
people all the time, this is a journey. And for us to be a
Yes.
better nation, for us to reconcile some of those things of the darkness, we have to tell everyone, not just people of color, but I talk to people who are of the majority, who we talk about the fact that this is a journey. And I'm okay
Hmm.
wherever you are on your journey, as long as you know that we're going to be on this journey.
Right.
And so that's one of the things that when I think about reconciling us to a better nation, this whole element around soft-mindedness is in the dismissing of facts, I think, is one of the things that really is harming us and hurting that process of reconciliation.
Right. And there is what you kind of mentioned, like people don't want to be uncomfortable. They don't want to have conversations that are going to make them uncomfortable. But it's in the being uncomfortable where you learn, where you grow, where you
Hmm.
are able to listen and accept something that may not have been what you're typically used to, right? Because in the age of social media, we only talk to like-minded people, right? We get they start to send us only the thoughts that we've clicked on, and they're feeding us more of the same. So the work of DNI is really to try to pull together the different elements of people's cultures and backgrounds, and to be able to share that out for the sake of really making an organization stronger. So
Yeah.
I don't know if
I
anyone
tell
had wanted
I
to
tell
add to that.
white males are diverse too. Well,
Yeah.
I just want to let me just say the thing that was is we have to always make sure that we include everyone in this conversation,
Yes.
because I don't let anybody off
Yes.
the hook. So I
Mhm.
tell white males, oh yeah, you're part of this too.
Mhm.
You're diverse. You may be neurodiverse. You may not be ethnically diverse, but you
Right.
have elements of diversity that can feed into your empathy wherever you are
Mhm.
to help us get
Absolutely.
again on that journey.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, Sorrel, did you want to add anything else before we move on?
No, I'm good. I'm afraid I might drop if I start talking again.
Okay, all right. It sounds good. Clarice, how about you? Are you good here?
Yeah, I'm good here. I was just going to talk about just a little bit, snippet about the collective vision. I think that one of
Mhm.
the things that hinders us is that we don't have a very collective vision of what
Mhm.
happens. I think we all have a different expectation of outcome when it comes to D&I work. And so people say, well, everyone is treated the same. No, they're not. They're very treated
Right.
And people have different expectations of you as a leader. They have different expectations of you as an employee. And especially if you are not part of the majority of, the people that look like you in leadership. And so I said, in order for us to reconcile that as a community is to be on the same page when it comes to that collective vision, because we have very different outcomes of what that expectation is. And so I think for a lot of the younger folks that are in corporate America, I think they have a completely different mindset when it comes to what their expectations are. So that's one of the things that, I am very intentional about in talking to them and working through those different processes that we mentioned earlier.
And so that sounds like it's more along the lines of merit, right? People feel like it's, your merit is what makes you successful. It's what takes you to the top. It makes you, and so Sorrel, did you want to add something to that merit discussion?
And that's where I was going to say, I do want to add something, is that people want to believe that they're treating everybody the same. They want to believe that they're making these decisions based off of merit.
Right.
But if you believe that, and you look at the structure of organizations and the senior leaders of organizations, and you notice that as you go up the ladder, you start to see less and less of your more ethnically, racially diverse, or from a gender diversity perspective, decrease. If you believe that, then you also have to believe that if you're a white man, then you're likely just a better performer. So those things, they can't coexist if you don't believe. If my decisions are based off of merit and everything's fair, then if you happen to be a white guy, then you're better at being a leader. And so something else, and that's what we talked about, the whole processes and kind of rooting out how do you impact these decisions, because to your point, Norm, you're not just going to go in there and change folks' minds. You're not going to make human beings not be human beings. So you have to actually change the systems to mitigate the things that humans are just going to do, because we can't help ourselves.
Yeah. Did anyone want to add to that? Because that is a struggle, right?
On Tuesday of this week, where the CEO said, "I don't see color." I said, "Well, that's the problem." That's the number one
of the biggest.
You don't see any color.
Right.
He said, "I don't see color. I do everything." I said, "Well, because there is no color for you to see, because everyone in this room besides me looks exactly like you. So it's easy to say you don't see any color." Or when you answer something,
you don't have to. Right,
exactly. So perfect. I can confirm that you do not see color. And so I think that is the denial of it, that of the very existence, that uncomfortableness of saying, what DEI programs there. And I think a lot of people that are looking for jobs, that are following this process on LinkedIn or wherever your social media sits, is if you are concerned about where you're going to fit long-term and the alliances that you're going to have in an organization, you need to ask, I looked in your page, and I know that you guys mentioned a lot about diversity. What kind of diversity efforts do you have? Do you have advocacy groups, employment resource support groups? What kind of programs are set up for emerging leaders or for mentorship or sponsorship? And
we have what? I couldn't hear you.
We have Juneteenth off.
Oh.
And she was like, "Oh." And it was a floating holiday. So it wasn't even an actual company holiday. It was a floating holiday. So, or they said you can take MLK, we have MLK Day off, so I think there are some organizations that are so behind, and, most of them are in the middle, and you've got a few that are fast forwarding. But I think most of the people, when it comes to this thinking, they're just like, you treat fair. Look at you, you're a VP. I'm like, there are 700. I'm pretty sure in my own scope, way more qualified than me, or equally qualified. So it's like to say, like, you're an exception. I think that's the way of making people feel comfortable and saying, you did well. Look at you, check you out. And it's really not a fair statement to say we don't see color. We treat people equally. You've been able to do this, and so other people should be able to do this. And those aren't true sentiments that are universal.
So how do you all reconcile, for instance, when the statistics around a more diverse workplace produces a more successful company, right? How do you reconcile that when the majority of these companies that are successful don't have that level of diversity that we're talking about? So is there, how do you reconcile that in your discussions?
Well,
Norm?
because of the Yeah, well, yeah, the uniqueness of what I do, I think probably is probably the toughest
Hmm.
because I have to convince people in a traditionally non-responsive field to diversity when we talk about architecture and engineering. You're building something that's not necessarily fully infused around inclusion.
Right.
So they don't necessarily see the value.
Hmm.
The thing
Hmm.
that I've said in all of this work now is that we have to establish an ROI for DE&I. So
Right.
every conversation needs to be led by how does this feed into your organizational strategy?
Hmm.
How does this support better performance? And now we actually have statistics around how inclusion not only helps people just in terms of acclimating to an organization and making it a more engaging workplace, but we also have hard bottom line numbers to say if you're an organization that's truly inclusive, you perform better. And
Right.
so what I do is I have different conversation for everybody
Hmm.
because I say this you teach it and preach it. You can't if you mess up on either one of them, they're going to kick you out of the room. And so I talk to leaders across the country. I have to talk. Everybody has a specific language that they're willing to hear. And some folks will, I don't care unless you point me to a statistical outcome
The bottom line.
that, in
Right.
my case, may be bottom line. And we can't be afraid of having those kinds of conversations because some people tell me, "Oh, that you're watering down the message," and I like,
Right.
no, you have to figure out how do you get into the door, and then once you get in, then you're able to enact program.
Right.
But you
It's
first
no
have to
good.
give
It's no good
them
talking to someone if they're not
the
listening. Right.
opportunity to
Right.
listen.
Right. Yeah. And Sorrel, like you look like you have a
Absolutely.
lot to say there.
I do. This is plus one on everything you said, Norm. There's a couple of things to sort of bullet point. The one thing I think about this and highlight what Norm says is you need to be able to articulate how the behaviors that the leaders engage in that drive inclusion impact the business of the organization that you work in
Right.
to at a minimum, because if you can do that you can say, hey, when leaders do this, it leads to this for people and it leads to this for the business. And yes, absolutely, Norm, people, there's lots of people who need to see that and won't budge without that. And some folks are like, well, they should just do it because it's the right thing. Well, they won't. Sorry, but they won't. And secondly, I also believe that asking for a business case and data sometimes is a red herring. And it's like data bullying, where it's like, show me the data before I do anything, when there's other things that leaders really want to do that they don't need to have the data to support what they really want to do. So that's what I mean when I say sometimes it's a bit of a red herring. And data bullying is like, well, show me the data or I won't do
Yeah.
it. When it's what I want to do, I don't need any data. It could be data telling me that
Exactly.
I shouldn't do it, but if I want to do it, I'll ignore it. So it's
Right.
complicated, and we have to consider all those things.
Yep. Clarice.
I'm going to say from a talent acquisition strategy, there's a few things. One, you can't convert. So you got to
Okay.
find that people that care. Two, you
Hmm.
have to look and three, we think about succession, long-term strategy, and career pathing, and we embed that into the TA strategy for it to be something that people really look for. And if it's not important to them and they don't care, then I always advise the recruiters, give them a broad band of candidates so that they have to pick from everyone, because pattern data actually allows them to see the actual people that they are hiring on a consistent basis. And even when they say like it's not biased, then I can say, well, actually, I'm going to humanize your data and show you that actually every person that you've hired is between the age of 27 and 31, and it has an Hispanic or a multicultural background and has X, Y, and Z. They say, oh, well, I'm from, for whatever area of town they're from. And I'm like, yeah, but that doesn't, but how unfair is that for a Hispanic woman? to be in the same field. So, so people try to rationalize, the information. So humanizing data, allowing people to see the big picture, and focusing. I feel like the best way that I've been successful is to focus on my allies, right? Not focus on everyone as a whole, because they're like, I don't care. I just want, someone to be in this position, but focusing on that, working on the hearts and minds of people that are interested in developing it, because the more they see it, the more they do it. Because people it's like inclusion. People don't want to be left out. So if they see other people rah-rahing around having their interns be Muslim and from different countries and speak different languages, then they say, oh yeah, me too. I'm cool. I'm a cool white, woke person. So I'm gonna also have me, a few international students that come through. And so there's a part of pride. But if it comes from the leadership down, if your C-suite doesn't view it as important, your leaders don't view it as important, your directors don't view it as important, your managers don't view it as important, and your supervisors don't view it as important. And having diversity in the workplace is easy. Having diversity in leadership is different.
That is very important, right? So you hear it, and representation matters, but you don't see the numbers, you don't see the people. And
Right.
They continue to say, hey, we're all about DE&I. We just had these new openings, but we hire people that don't look like the people we say we're looking to. We can't
Right.
find them. We can't bring them in, that we're not reaching them. And so it just is allowed to just continue, to just cycle through, and you're not seeing the impact. And then there is also the other challenge, which is when you bring in people like us, what are you doing to keep us? Right? And when you're bringing in that diversity, when you're bringing in the LGBTQs, like, what are you doing to make sure that they are comfortable and that they can be successful and they can thrive? And so how do you all deal with that in your organizations?
I was gonna say, thinking about Clarice, your role is that I feel like a lot of people lean really heavily on talent acquisition to try to diversify their workforce.
Right.
And what often happens is people overlook the practices and things that do in organizations that will drive these folks out the door when we hire. So we end up with the leaky bucket. You're trying to hire in all these people, and they're having not the greatest experience, so they leave. So the way we think about that is, how do we help people understand, again, with data, humanizing data, to point to the evidence that say these group of people are leaving your organization at a much higher rate. These groups of people are telling you that they're not having great experiences from a growth and development point, and that's why they're leaving. That you as leaders are accountable, have responsibility and ability to grow and develop these people. Us as DEI, the DEI team, we can't make you do that with the people who report to you. You have to do that. We're telling you what to do. Here's the information that's telling you where the issue is, and here's what you can do to help change these outcomes. And by the way, if you don't, here are the consequences to your business. That's the best that we can really do to get people to change. And they need to be able to look at that and be like, oh crap, you're right. We need to do something about that. That's from a high level how I think about it, at least what we focus on, to actually try to increase diversity. Because if you're trying to increase X percent over a year, and you're hiring, let's say 5% of your hires are, you hire 5% more Black people within a year, or Hispanic Latinx, and then half of them leave, where are you going to get?
Yeah. Norm?
Yeah, I just wanted to double down on what both of you all just said, because it's so critical. Because absolutely, to Sorrell's point, talent acquisition is typically kind of like where they, let's solve for everything else, because then I kind of keep my hands away from the dirt. We know certain levels, talent acquisition takes place on the golf course, when I go have drinks with you. We go meet at a party. So the thing that I talk about now is, like, I tell people, stop with the mentorship. That's great, but that's just the thing to kind of make you feel good. I said, hit me with sponsorship.
Yes.
Because see, that was one of my favorite DE&I folks used to say, She's like, I'm going to make sure that your name is spoken in rooms that you're in and rooms that you're not in.
Right.
That's
Absolutely.
sponsorship.
Yes.
And that's where talent acquisition starts. And so when you start to have these programs, again, we can't make everybody love this stuff, but we can make you as a leader. And I would say, no. You don't, as a VP, I don't go and find the VP who's kind of like the up and brown person who kind of fits the narrative, and I don't have to. I said, no. SVP, you go and find the senior manager or director or supervisor, and you sponsor them.
Right.
Because see, that's where you have to work, and that's where we can start to create the change around, again, not always relying on our systems to create the solution. We need to create the solution holistically, and it's with the people, again, as we know, how decisions get made, and they don't get made necessarily when I send my application in, because I think most of us have probably gotten a whole lot of jobs where we weren't just like on Indeed. Our Indeed was a conversation with somebody else who led to a conversation who led to somebody else's conversation.
It's relationships. It's relationships, right? I mean, you know, at the end of the day, that's really what makes the difference. So if we look at like Martin Luther King and we look at the dream, right, that he had, you know, and we're looking at the 60s, I mean, are we seeing any progress in any ways, you know, that you can share? I mean, for me, I would say, you know, at least we are now able to hold different jobs in different positions.
Right.
You know, we've been able to you know, integrate into a lot of different areas that we weren't then. Like right before, they just had a rule: we don't hire blacks. You know, even if it was, you know, a janitor, or we don't hire them to do these various jobs. So for me, I see there's progress there, but the challenge is that maybe if we're in the room, we still have a problem bringing in others into that same room.
Right.
And so, you know, what would you all say are those challenges as well?
I got into it with my mom. We had a heated, passionate conversation about this not too long ago. And she was like, you know, anyone who's born after between like the late 80s and 90s, mama said, you guys don't know anything. Like, you guys weren't around. And so I think there's been a ton of changes. Like there's been a lot of changes. I remember when I left to go to La Sierra, they said, you know, my mom said, just graduate. If you just graduate, we'll be happy.
Just finish, right.
Finish, yeah. And mom says, you can get a nice job as a secretary somewhere, as a, you know, an administrative assistant. And I was like, what's a secretary?
Right.
She was like, I was Googling what. So that was their aspirations for me, was like, if you can get a nice admin job, you know, maybe an office manager, or like a good admin assistant job, you're great with talking to people, so you can help the boss around. And those were high aspirations for me at the, you know, so she's like, I'm gonna send you to college. You're gonna go in there into that office with a college degree. And so,
you're
you know,
not gonna have the same challenges. Right.
And so now, so I think it's at least in my generation, I feel like there has been a lot of changes. I feel like there's so much more work to do. And I think we mentioned it earlier, there's so much fatigue around. Now I see DEIB, DEIC, DEIABC. I see all of these different acronyms now because everybody wants to join this bandwagon. But I think it may be fading from having a fundamental role within the organization, but I don't think the movement of it has faded, because now you have new managers that are part of that whole system coming in after COVID. So you have people that are coming into the organization and that are true allies, that are like, no, I want to make sure my department is very diverse, because I feel like the best ideas come from diverse groups and backgrounds of people. So I think it has changed. I think it's just so much more to go. I don't think that my grandmother or my mom could ever imagine a Black president, much less a Black CEO or Black billionaires, as many as I think there's 47 Black billionaires on Forbes. So I don't think she would even fathom that, you know. And I could tell by her own aspirations for me, it's like, if you work for good white people, you'll be, you know, I'm from the South. If you work for good white people, you're gonna shoot far. And so you know, so now I think my grandmother would be proud of me because of the progress. So I think so much more work to do, but I think we're in the door. I think someone's propping the door. They got their foot in the door, and they're just like, "Come on in, everybody, come on in." So I think we have a long ways to go, but we are a lot further than we started.
Okay. And how about you, Sorrel?
I've been thinking about this as you said this, and I'm struggling because my first reaction was I'd rather be Black in America in 2023 than in 1963. That was
Absolutely.
my immediate reaction. So from
Yeah.
that point, I would say I
Absolutely.
think we have made progress. But then I
Yes.
also started thinking about things that the gaps that still exist, either within organizations, within the communities, whether it's wealth gaps, incarceration rates, whatever
Yeah.
these things are. I'm like,
Mhm.
I don't think that we've made progress, and in some cases, I think it's gotten worse in some dimensions. But
Okay.
broadly, I would say, yeah, we have, and especially organizations. There's, I think, to your point, Clarice, is places we just wouldn't have been able to work before that we
Right.
can work. So I
Right.
think for roles that we wouldn't be able to have before that we can have. So have we made progress? Yes. Do we have a lot more to go and a lot more work to do? 100%.
Okay. And Norm?
Yeah, I kind of struggle with this too because I was reading Dr. King's book, Where Do We Go From Here, and
Yes.
Chaos in Community, and he was quoting some of the statistics back in 1967, and he said, you know, the percentage of African Americans in menial jobs, they called them menial jobs back then, it was 75%. Today, what we call middle class or lower middle class jobs, workers, blue collar workers, African Americans make about 63%. So have we made progress? Absolutely.
Right.
The
Right.
incremental element of it is still a problem with me. And it even exacerbated itself when we had COVID, and we're still in some of the throes of COVID, but we all saw the impact on the workers. And those essential workers was the nice prettied up term for the menial jobs, as Dr. King called them.
Frontline.
And so those folks suffered immensely from not only just a financial impact, because you saw what it did to women of color from a financial perspective, because many of those were single-headed households and they lost their jobs, but also from the health perspective, being exposed and having the transitional effects of being infected with COVID and still having to go to work, and what did that do to their long-term health outcomes. And so when I look at it, it's you know, I think we have greater level of access, we have greater levels of opportunity and wealth, but almost going back to Sorrel, what he said is that I think there's some things that we suffer from, because if you know, I'm from Michigan, in Detroit, we had in the 60s and 70s Black home ownership around the high 75, 76% rate. If you go into Detroit today, for the few people that are still there that own a house, it's probably worth next to nothing.
Right.
So our financial wealth and our abilities to have some of the things that in the 60s were, and also we had a higher percentage of households that were headed by two parents or two people in the household.
Right.
Our dynamic is totally different now. So I struggle a little bit with that. I am, you know, always encouraged that we have opportunity, and there are, you know, different points of access that we have. But I always look about what's kind of the greater, the masses that we're trying to help affect. And I just see that in some of those instances, we're probably behind.
Yeah. And so we've got roughly about 5 more minutes left. And so I have not given this question to you all in advance. So you're about to be put on the spot, you know, but you know, you guys are sharp, so it shouldn't be a problem. But, you know, Clarice, if you were, you know, to be able, what is your DE&I dream? Like, I have a dream that from a DE&I standpoint, what would that be for you?
Danette. So I think my DI dream would really be that I said this a lot in quotes, is that we don't have to have standards around DEI, like in the workplace. Like I want it should be the norm. I want DEI to be embedded in the fabric of how we hire, who we hire, where we hire, what we do, part of the infrastructure, part of the psychology. Like it shouldn't be like I'm in talent acquisition, so I have to bring data, to the forefront all the time to prove every point. And so I hope to get to a place where I hope that we get to a place where we don't have to have this conversation. We're talking about the progressive nature of what's happening, not having to say, let's look at badgering HR, badgering our hiring managers, badgering leadership. I hope that we get to a point where it's just the flow, the natural flow, and then we do something else. But for this, the natural flow of progression. That's my dream for DEI.
Okay, Sorrel, you have a dream that
one day, it really is one day, that
right.
people will not be judged by the color of their skin, their gender, their sexual orientation, identity, or any aspect of visible, invisible diversity, but by their ability to actually do the job. That's my DEI dream.
That's a beautiful dream. I love it. Okay, Norm, you have a dream that
I have a dream that racism becomes obsolete.
Yeah.
Because racism and discrimination is, I call it an estrangement of the mind, the body, and the spirit and logic.
Yeah.
It makes no sense. And so I would love to get into a rational space where we could eliminate that. And again, dream. But to me, that would fulfill all what Dr. King about in moving us into kind of that desired state and how we can create again this wholeness of nation and people. So that's where I would like to be.
Yes, well, I agree with everything that you all have shared today. I also have a dream that what we're doing, is not necessary. Everything that you all said, that we're giving the opportunities. Everyone is not judged by the content of their skin, but their characters, right? Like we really want to be able to get to that place. And so I thank each and every one of you for the work that you're doing on a day-to-day basis. I know that, the work really requires that we roll up our sleeves and fight a lot of times. And, and it's not necessarily just the battle of fighting, but how to fight, right? Because, as I start in this position, I realize that it's not as important about me fighting. I really just want to win, right? Mm-hmm. And so how do we get to those wins that are going to, produce the outcomes that we're looking for, But in the meantime, I applaud each of you for the work that you're doing, the impact that you're making, the struggles that you are, doing for the sake of the culture, and for the people that you're here to represent. So I want to thank you for that. And I also want to thank you all for being Healthy Heart Nation ambassadors and the work that we're doing in this fight together. So I want to invite everyone to join us every third Friday, 4:00 Pacific Standard, 7:00 Eastern. We will have programming coming to you from business, education, justice, and health. And, we have a dream that one day we will get here and we'll get there together. So thank you for your time.